So you're walking down the street with your reactive dog who's afraid of other dogs and other people. And you're walking down the street with him, and then all of a sudden you see his triggers. You see a woman walking her dog and they're coming straight for you. And now your dog has gone over threshold. Now your dog is lunging, he's pulling, he's barking, maybe he's bitten in the past, so that might be a prospect for right now. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, what do I do? And some trainers have told you, well, you should correct him because you don't want him to know that that is a desired behavior. You don't want him thinking that he should bark and aggress towards people, so you need to correct that behavior. And on the other hand, you hear the positive community say, well, you should offer that treat so that you're treating him emotionally and you're showing him that there's a positive outcome. And you're wondering, well, what do I do? Do I correct him for the behavior, or do I make sure that there's a positive outcome and that it all ends in butterflies? Well, that's what we're going to answer today, so make sure you keep watching. What's up, guys? It's Jenna with Dog Liaison, where I coach you on how to enhance your dog's mental health. And on this channel, we break down scientific research in order to inform and educate us on how to train dogs. Today, we are talking about whether or not you should reinforce your dog's undesirable aggressive behavior. So when your dog starts getting a little overwhelmed because he's fearful of a trigger and he starts aggressing, maybe he's lunging, he's barking, he's biting, what do we do? Do we treat that to make sure that it has a positive outcome, or do we correct it and make sure that he knows it's an undesired behavior? It's a pretty contentious topic in the dog training community because on one hand, you do want to make sure it has a positive outcome. You want to make sure your dog realizes that this thing is not anything to be afraid of. This thing is just living their life. They're not doing anything. And on the other hand, you also want to make sure that he doesn't necessarily repeat his aggressive behavior again in the future. You want to make sure that you're not promoting the barking and the lunging and the pulling. So both of these things are true. How do we accomplish both goals? That's what we're talking about. So if you're excited, make sure you hit subscribe, make sure you hit like. My entire channel is dedicated to fear responses in dogs, and this is going to be a pretty broad conversation, but make sure you check out some of my other videos later on because I really like to get a little bit more nuanced about fear and aggression in dogs. And let's get started. What this question really boils down to is, can you reinforce fear? And this is kind of a complicated answer because really needs some unpacking. For such a small question, it really needs a lot of unpacking. So reinforce just means reward. It just means the probability that a behavior will occur again. It specifically pertains to operant conditioning, which we're not going to digress too much into in this video. But when you hear the word reinforce, it has to do with a psychological principle, operant conditioning. And it just indicates the probability that a behavior outcome will happen again. That's all reinforce does, okay? Fear is an emotion, but more specifically, fear is a hazard avoidance signal in the mind. So what I think of is when your dog is experiencing fear, there's sort of like a blinking light in his brain saying, avoid, 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 hazard, 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 possible death, possible death, possible death. And that's all that fear is. Every species comes equipped with it. Every species comes equipped with a systematic tool to prevent itself from dying. And that's all that fear is just that signal. So really, the question, can you reinforce fear, is actually asking, can you increase the probability of a hazard avoidance signal going off? And the answer to that question is no. You cannot increase the probability that a hazard avoidance signal will go off because the hazard avoidance signal is automatic. It's an emotion. It's not an actual tangible behavior that you can increase or decrease the probability of. There are a lot of independent variables. That being said, because that's not the end of the story here, that being said, what ends up coming out of the hazard avoidance signal is the fear behavior. So you end up having this hazard avoidance signal that goes off in the mind, in the dog's brain. And then as a result of that signal, you end up getting the behavior outcome, which is the barking, the lunging, the growling, etc. Now, the fear behavior absolutely can be increased and decreased in probability. And therefore, the fear behavior can be reinforced. So just to reiterate, you cannot increase the probability or decrease the probability. You cannot reinforce fear and the hazard avoidance. But you can reinforce fear behavior and the behavior outcome of fear hazard avoidance signal. So what do we do? Because if both camps are kind of true, and that's what we've just found, is that in both cases they're both right, which do we know what to do in what moment? So the answer, as always, falls in science, and more specifically, it falls in neurobiology. And so that's what we're going to talk about. If you're enjoying this video so far, make sure you hit like. If you like taking on the more neurobiology aspect of it, definitely hit like. Because it's important that we understand that there's a science to why dogs are doing what they're doing. It's not arbitrary. So let's break down the neurobiology of it. You're walking down the street and you see the trigger and you go, oh my gosh, if I keep walking, my dog's gonna implode. So be it. You start walking, your dog sees the other stimulus, he sees the person walking her dog, and he goes over threshold. He starts lunging, he starts bullying, he starts barking. In the time between him seeing the stimulus and the time that he actually starts responding, so the behavior outcome, in that short little window, a lot happens. In this brief little millisecond, a lot of stuff goes on. And that's what I'm about to break down. So, when he sees the stimuli, when he sees the dog and the other owner, all of that information that he's seeing, he's smelling, he's feeling, he's tasting, he's hearing, all of that information gets sent everywhere in the brain. Every system in the brain gets that information. Sometimes you will hear trainers that will say that only certain pieces are getting that information. And I understand how that story gets proliferated. And to be honest, I used to also inadvertently proliferate it, okay? But the reality is it's not a matter of different systems not getting the information. It's actually a matter of whether or not they have the ability to understand the information they're getting. So the back of the brain is in charge of more of the emotional context. It's in charge of the amygdala, it's in charge of the hippocampus and a bunch of other things, okay? And the front part of the brain is in charge of logic and reasoning. That's the prefrontal cortex, that's the cerebral cortex, okay? So I have sort of overgeneralized and said the front part of the brain is the logic part of the brain, and the back part of the brain is the emotional part of the brain. Now again, that's just for imagery. That is a generalization, okay? And in the future, I will be creating a video that's a little bit more nuanced on that element, okay? But that's a very broad. The brain is a very complex element, and so this is sort of just a generalization, okay? So the amygdala is in charge of the fight, flight, or freeze response. It's in charge of hazard avoidance. It says, oh my gosh, there's a stimulus right there that could potentially kill us. We need to rally the troops. We need to get ready for action. We need to get ready for some sort of outcome, right? The amygdala sends out this information to everybody else in the brain and says, look guys, some issue's about to go down. We're about to die. We need to get moving, right? More specifically, what ends up happening is it releases adrenaline and it tells the heart that it needs to start pumping more blood and that it needs to be sending this blood to certain systems. And this is where it gets really important. They're only going to send energy expenditure to certain systems. Not everybody is going to get the same amount of energy expenditure. When we're thinking about where energy expenditure is being sent, it's being mostly sent to the back of the brain. It's being mostly sent to the emotional part of the brain because that's in charge of the fight, flight, or freeze response. And so it's trying to be very methodical. The amygdala is trying to be very methodical about where it sends expenditure because it understands that we need to be smart about our resources. We are limited in how much blood we can pump in this moment, and we need to only be recruiting the absolute dire elements. And so these other systems like reproduction, like digestion, like logic and reasoning, this front part of the brain, these other systems get underfueled. These other systems do not get the energy expenditure that other elements are. And so what that means is that, for example, the logic part of the brain is not working at its best capacity, merely because it's not given the resources it needs to work at its best capacity. It's not going to be able to think logically and reasonably and effective because it literally is just not being equipped with the resources it needs. And the reason it's not being equipped with those resources is because these other systems need it more. This sort of idea that it's like the dog is walking 1 second very logically, and then all of a sudden you might see this sort of on-off switch, right? What's really happening is that the entire body is preparing itself for a major event, and it perceives that it's imminent. It perceives that this threat is happening right this second. And if we do not respond effectively, if we do not respond quickly and efficiently, we're going to die. That's how the body responds. It thinks, this is a life or death, and if I don't do that this way, I die. And that's why we know when a dog starts displaying aggressive behavior, like lunging, like barking, like pulling, like biting, we know that it's not happening as a product of logic and reasoning. We know that it's a byproduct of these other systems that are in control of his actions. We know that his decision making is not even really a factor. Now, in a second, we're going to talk about how much it is a factor. I'm going to explain that in a second, okay? But we know that for the most part, when it's in the moment and it's a hazard avoidance response and your dog starts pulling, there's not a whole lot of logic going on there. It is very emotional. It is very erratic. And so from that regard, you need to be looking at training him from an emotional standpoint. You need to be thinking, if I feed him right now, I will diminish the hazard avoidance severity. And this is sort of the idea with the treats, right? Is that if the hazard avoidance signal is very loud, then when you throw a bunch of positive outcomes at it and you throw treats at it, then you are quieting the severity of the hazard avoidance signal, and you're saying, hey, come down, come down, come down. It's not that major, it's not that major, because it's resulting in something positive. And this, what I've just described to you, is the Pavlovian response. It's just about association, it's about classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is just merely about see a stimulus and it either results in something good or something bad. And effectively, it's emotional, right? So if the dog is responding emotionally, we should treat him and train him emotionally. But there's a catch, because let me play this out for you. If you are walking down the street and your dog goes over threshold because he sees the stimulus and you know he's acting emotionally, so we need to feed him to respond to him emotionally, then what ends up happening is twofold. One, he ends up getting treated as a byproduct of walking down the street and overreacting. And two, likely the scary stimuli, the dog and his owner, are going to walk away. So he's walking down the street, he aggresses. As an outcome of that, he ends up getting treats from his owner, and the scary things, the dog and the other person, walk away. So the outcome of that sequence was good. And this is where it gets tricky, because if that happens one time, it's not likely to be that big of an issue. But if you've now done that routine 10, 15, 17 times, now the dog is probably recognizing a pattern. He probably didn't know the first time that, hey, me behaving this way results in me getting treats. But if he's going to do it 15, 25, 50 times, he's absolutely going to recognize the pattern. And this now turns into operant conditioning. And this is where things get messy, because it really just depends on how much logic is being at play. So the question really boils down to, okay, if every part of the brain is getting this information and the possibility for a learning outcome is there within routine, how much logic and reasoning is really at play? How much is the dog actually thinking reasonably whatsoever? And the reality is, the most scientific answer I can give you is we don't know. We don't know exactly how much energy expenditure and how much learning is possible in a short little second. And the reason is it's very dependent on a lot of variables. How much learning can happen is dependent on, first and foremost, the individual dog's personality, okay, and his individual perceptions. Secondly, it's dependent on how scary the stimulus is. So fear can come in a lot of varieties. It can come in a lot of variables. It can look very different, right? It can be very easy. So for example, I scare easily. My entire life, it hasn't been very difficult for a person to walk through the door and say, "Don't get scared, Jenna." And I inevitably jump and startle, and then I stop and I go, "Haha, just kidding, false alarm, my bad." I overreacted, right? And so even though the hazard avoidance signals go off in my mind, it doesn't take long for me to recover from that moment, especially because I do it a lot, especially because I quickly assess that this has been a thing for Jenna. This is what she does, right? On the other hand, that would be considered a very mild fear. It's nothing compared to what might necessitate a more aggressive behavior. And so if I see a dog who is pulling and lunging and barking and biting, that's indication to me that this is not just a little subtle thing. This is indication to me that the dog is experiencing excessive hazard avoidance signals, which might presume that he is not thinking as reasonably as one would if it was less dangerous or if it was less fear-inducing, right? So how much logic is being used, we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because it changes depending on the context and it changes depending on the dog. There are too many variables for us to quantify how logical the dog can be in that moment. It's just too many variables, right? So can a dog learn the first time that if I bark and growl, then I get a positive outcome and I should repeat that behavior in the future? You could walk your dog down tomorrow and for the very first time he could aggress at another dog and you could turn around and give him a treat and the other dog would walk away and your dog would learn, okay, now I need to bite people every single time I want them to walk away. Is it possible he could learn that? Yes, it's possible. Is it at all likely? No, it's not likely at all. Now, if you're doing that over and over and over and over again in that exact capacity, inevitably, eventually, you would run into problems. Inevitably, you would be teaching your dog that I need to bite people to get them to walk away. So now what we've kind of set up is the pros and cons to using the emotional aspect, which would be like a Pavlovian response, which would be treating the hazard avoidance signal and trying to diminish that hazard avoidance signal. And we've seen the pros and cons to the behavioral outcome of it, which is more operant conditioning, which would be more about increasing or decreasing the likelihood that the behavior is going to happen again. There are pros and cons to both sides. And so now we need to know what to do with that. And the answer is you use both. It's not a matter if you're only using Pavlov or you're only using operant. It's not a matter of this or that. It's not binary. You get to use both. But the key is that when you're using both, you need to use them in the right order, and you need to be using them strategically. It's not just a matter of throwing treats up in the air willy-nilly. No, 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 no. So first and foremost, the best time to diminish hazard avoidance signal is when it's starting to escalate, not when it is so high and so bright and flashing that everything in the system believes that the threat is imminent and we must respond. That is not the time to train. You need to abort mission and get out of there, okay? The time to train is when maybe the hazard avoidance starts kind of flickering, right? And the sign is kind of like going, you know, I don't know, man, the potential for risk is pretty high. And in practical terms, if you were talking about walking down the street, likely this would be at a distance. So the closer you are to the stimulus or to the threat, the more imminent the threat is, right? But if you increase distance, then presumably to your dog, the threat is less dire. So you would want to increase distance greatly in order to diminish the hazard avoidance perception. And then as this light is starting to kind of flicker and the blinking light is going, hey, this might be bad, right? That's when you start using the Pavlovian response, the classical response of giving treats in order to diminish that signal. The idea is that this signal is going off saying something bad might happen, something bad might happen, and you're going, no, you're getting treats, so see, nothing bad is happening. You're getting treats, see? This is resulting in something good. And the hazard avoidance signal is going to go, oh, okay, I guess we overreacted. And what's going to end up happening is now all of this blood and all of this energy expenditure that was being recruited to fight, flight, or freeze is instead going to be dispersed evenly like it should be, which means that now that you have been able to diminish this hazard avoidance signal, you are going to effectively equip the logic part of the brain with the energy expenditure that it needs. Now the front of the brain can reasonably and efficiently run. And now that that has happened, now that the front of the brain is being equipped the way it can and the way it should be, now you can start to focus on operant conditioning, and you can start to focus on more of the behavioral component of it, and you can start to give your dog more clear criteria of what is expected of him. The key here is to make sure that you are smart about not letting your dog display these undesired behaviors like lunging, pulling, barking, okay? Because the reality is that those behaviors will inevitably be rewarded in some capacity. So what I mean by that is if your dog bites or if your dog aggresses towards someone, probably that someone's going to walk away. Not many people are going to stick around to see what's going to happen, right? So inevitably what has just happened is negative punishment, which is another form of operant conditioning. But effectively the dog has accomplished his goal, right? The dog says, I didn't want to be attacked. I growled, and so therefore the person walked away, and therefore I accomplished my goal, therefore growling works, right? Again, as I mentioned before, that's going to have to be repeated several times. It's going to happen over and over and over again before the dog recognizes that pattern. But if you continue to let your dog practice that behavior, if you continue to let your dog aggress like that, inevitably he's getting the opportunity to practice that sequence, and inevitably he's going to recognize the pattern, which is one of the reasons it's super important that you're not letting him practice that in the first place. You need to beat him to the punch. You cannot let him get to that place at the beginning at all, okay? Now there's a second component to this, which is talking and petting your dog. And that could also be called like coddling your dog, right? And this is a pretty contentious element to this similar argument as well. So if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on that, make sure you hit subscribe, because that will be the topic of my next video. And I recommend you check that out and you get notified when that video is posted. So make sure you hit subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit like. Tell me if you have any questions regarding this system, regarding this hazard avoidance signal and how we handle it, how we handle fear, and let me know in the comments. I'll see you guys later.